very good morning, afternoon, and evening to you, depending on wherever you are joining us from. I'd like to welcome you to the first of the dialogue series, Breathe In. The Breathe In dialogues are envisioned as a platform for generating discussions on indoor air quality issues, concerns, and solutions. We will be bringing to you topics under various themes: regulatory convergence, integrated design and technology, monitoring and management, and most importantly, how do we raise awareness and communicate to occupants? We at EDS, along with our partners, Society for Indoor Environment, have curated these dialogues under the Cleaner Air and Better Health project. Today's session takes a deep dive on indoor air quality in the context of healthcare, especially hospitals. So a little brief about Cleaner Air and Better Health project. We call it CABH. It's a 5-year project supported by the USAID with the aim to strengthen air pollution mitigation and reduce exposure to air pollution in selected regions of India. The project is implemented by a consortium led by CEW, and it includes ASAR, Social Impact Advisors, Environmental Design Solutions, Enviro-Legal Defense Firm, and Vital Strategies. My name is Nidhi Gupta, and I have been tasked to be the moderator and timekeeper for today's session. And as you see here, we have a packed session with esteemed speakers. So we have Dr. Brendon Burley. He's a healthcare practitioner leader at BKM and Associates, and also a chair of ASHRAE Standard 62.1. We have Dr. Shukla Das, who's the head faculty at Department of Microbiology, UCMS in Delhi. Unfortunately, Dr. Ravideep Singh is trying to yet join us. There has been an emergency, but we may have him in the future sessions in case he's not able to join us today. We have Saumitri Das, Project Management Specialist Environment at USAID, Om Prakash Singh, Chief of Party CABH project at CEW, and my colleague Dipanjali Vatkar from Environmental Design Solutions. So first up, we have Om Prakash Singh. He calls himself OP, who is the Chief of Party for the CABH project. OP will provide us a deeper insight onto this project. Over to you, OP. I can manage the slides for you.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you for setting up the context. It's my privilege and honor on behalf of CABH Consortium to present the brief overview of Cleaner Air and Better Health project in presence of such learned speakers and the audience right now. The project supported by USAID was convened in 2021. Next slide, please. So with India's climate commitments to achieve net zero emission by 2070, there is an impetus to address air pollution in the long run. And we all know that the government initiatives have made progress, whether in providing access to clean energy alternatives or creating an enabling system for it. And this has been done by multiple programs and schemes such as National Clean Air Program, launched in 2019, Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, launched in 2016, and Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Electric Vehicles FAME scheme, launched in 2015. Next slide, please. So all we know that right now, the Cleaner Air and Better Health project, supported by United States Agency for International Development, USAID, seeks to establish evidence-based comprehensive models for better air quality management systems in India. And as rightly informed by Nidhi, that this program is being implemented by a consortium, which is being led by CEW, which is one of Asia's leading not-for-profit research institution. And of course, supported by ASAR, ELDF, EDS, who are host of this Breathe-In series, and Vital Strategies as an important consortium partner. Can we have next, please? An overall goal of accelerating reduction of particulate matter levels in India. This project has two objectives. One is to strengthen air pollution mitigation in India, and second one is to reduce exposure to air pollution in India. And this we aim to achieve through consultative processes, evidence-based and targeted approach. And the consortium is working towards, as informed earlier, establishing evidence-based comprehensive models for air quality management in the country. Right now, the CABH intervention, we are working to scale solutions across the states in the country. And along with this, in the selected districts of the country, we are piloting innovative models to tackle the emissions and air pollution in different sectorial interventions. Next slide, please. So we are talking about forming an ecosystem that enables adoption of cleaner practices in multiple sectors and strengthening cooperation between various stakeholders to accelerate and CAP's clean air goals. And we will do this by creating a result-based, impact-oriented playbook to scale solutions and influence the clean air discourse. And this all we are drawing on a 5-pillar solution map, which consists of enabling monitoring and regulatory reforms, enhancing use of data for decision making, elevating sectoral transition for clean energy through innovative scalable solutions, empowering citizens through outreach and awareness, and equipping the institutions with relevant capacity for informed decision making. When we talk about enabling monitoring and regulatory reforms, here we basically talk about, for example, we talk about reducing emissions from industrial and construction sectors by strengthening self-regulation and aided by credible data for continuous emission monitoring systems and ambient air quality monitoring systems. We are also talking about here how we can advance in health buildings by establishing protocols, indoor air quality dashboards, for example, on monitoring and management of indoor air pollution. Next slide, please. On enhancing the use of data for decision making, it's basically to facilitate a responsive data aggregation system to aid action, monitored and forecasted data, and hyperlocal source inventory. Here, we'd like to generate evidence and collection of local health data to establish health benefits of air quality action, and also strengthen the air quality decision support system through partnerships with the government. Next, please. While we talk about elevating sectoral transitions to clean energy through innovative solutions, we basically talk of interventions like improving access to clean cooking fuel, especially by boosting the LPG distribution system in the country. We have been able to conduct the largest LPG distribution survey in the country right now, inducing transition to electric vehicles by building business viability cases, assisting energy transition in MSME industrial clusters by building custom furnaces to aid the transition from coal to natural gas, and of course, promoting innovative tested solutions for large-scale deployment of battery-powered variable winter heatings, green hydrogen cook stoves, and electrified mini tractors for small farms. So these are some of the innovative work that CABH is right now doing at the ground level. Next slide, please. Empowering citizens through outreach and awareness is basically to mainstream air quality issues within the communities and health practitioners and build agencies to take preventive action. Activating clean air action hubs in non-attachment cities is one of the priority interventions that we are conducting. And also, this is clubbed with implementing behavior change interventions to encourage clean air practices, which may include adoption of clean fuels, clean construction and demolition practices, and so on. Next, please. When we talk about equipping institutions with relevant capacity for informed decision making, it's basically providing the health sector with data and tools to integrate clean air as a strategy for health promotion. We're also talking about engaging government to improve sustainable transportation and city planning. We also take in cognizance guiding development and adoption of airshed management approaches, deploying pollution mitigation technologies, impaneling and guiding pilot projects with the private sector and project developers for design and retrofit of indoor air quality. Next slide, please. So basically, in nutshell, if I talk of the clean air and better health approach, it's to innovate, integrate, and implement for impact. Next, please. When we talk of impact, largely what we are looking at right now is to have a reduction of almost 50% in the air quality improvement, wherein we can, in the intervention areas of CABH. For examples, we are looking at 60% reduction in criteria emissions from 150 units in MSME cluster, We are looking ahead to demonstrate 40% reduction in particulate matter at pilot construction sites. We are looking ahead 80% of the households sustain use of clean cooking fuel. They use only the clean cooking fuel at the moment. We're also talking of improving the capacities of at least 10 state pollution control boards on implementation of legal and judicial reforms. Plus, we're also talking of in the terms of community, we want to activate at least 20 clean air action hubs in these non-attainment cities. Also activate 14 sentinel surveillance sites, and also working towards that keep at least 200 emitting sources, polluting plants, they adopt emission trading system as a part of it. Next, please. Finally, so I would like to conclude by saying that the whole CABH project is built solutions to scale and institutionalize the best practices that can go a long way in improving the air quality in the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, OP. We will now have Saumitri Das, Project Management Specialist on the Environment and Team Lead on Pollution and Health Impacts at the USAID, to share his remarks on efforts taken towards air pollution mitigation in India. Over to you, Saumitri.
Thanks, Nidhi. Good afternoon to everyone. And again, of course, a good morning and good evening too for those joining us from abroad too. I'm very happy to be here today for the first of the Breathing series dialogue. Clean air, it's an environmental and health priority for the United States. Air quality issues are a growing concern around the world, including here in India. So globally, about 9 out of 10 people breathe unhealthy air. Now, this is the largest environmental health risk in the world, responsible for 6 million premature deaths in a year. I mean, that's more than all the HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. So at USAID, we are addressing the multifaceted challenge that air pollution poses, supporting both regulatory reform and broad citizen engagement so that we can achieve the maximum impact for those most affected. Now, USAID's air quality programming aims to mitigate ambient and household air pollution to reduce adverse health impacts, advance climate change mitigation and adaptation, and promote inclusive, sustainable development. In India, USAID is developing local solutions with the government, communities, and the private sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants, which in turn improves public health, reduces poverty and inequality, and lessens climate change impacts. This Breathing series is, of course, our attempt in that direction, and I look forward to hearing the speakers today and, of course, the discussion that are planned for the dialogue today. Thank you again for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, OP. Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you, Saumitri. My mistake. Moving on, today's topic focuses on healthcare. What are the factors that impact indoor air quality? Are there any guidelines that can be followed during design and operation to improve indoor air quality? Are there any best practices that we can take any lessons from? All these and much more, and is what our next set of speakers will cover. First up, setting the context on intersection between indoor air quality and buildings, especially enclosed buildings such as hospitals and commercial that we see today. I now invite my colleague Dipanjali Vatkar. Dipanjali, you may share your screen now.
Thank you, Nidhi. So hope my screen is visible. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone who have joined online. So today's, so I'm just setting a context on intersection between indoor air pollution and health in buildings. Indoor air pollution has been recognized as a significant health concern on a global scale over the past several decades. Awareness on the impacts of air pollution began to emerge primarily in response to the visible and harmful effects of industrialization and urbanization. Air pollution is the fourth leading cause of death worldwide. Household air pollution is gaining increased attention. We spend an increasing amount of time indoors, making indoor air quality very important. It has become a topic of concern since the air quality indoors could be much, much worse than the outdoors. Like any other building types, healthcare facilities where patients' immune system are compromised, maintaining a good indoor quality is imperative. Healthcare-associated infections, or HAI, are a significant concern of healthcare facilities. Indoor air quality is a major concern of HAI. Along with HAI, poor indoor air quality can lead to various chronic diseases such as asthma and tuberculosis, and can have neurosensory effects such as discomfort and reduced productivity. These are generally categorized as building-related issues or sick building syndrome. It is crucial to understand factors impacting the indoor air quality. More or less, these factors are typical for any enclosed air-conditioned building, including commercial or hospital. Indoor air quality is influenced by outdoor air. This includes the general outdoor pollutants determined by road traffic, such as PM and carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. The presence of industries or factories in the vicinity that produce unhealthy fumes also affect the air quality in hospitals. In a microclimatic environment, temperature and relative humidity can affect the growth of microorganisms. The second one is the pathway of pollutants. The penetration of pollutants, both from the outdoor sources as well as the indoor sources within a building, is influenced by a driving force that connects the sources to the pathways. Air pollutants could penetrate through the leaks and gaps of the building envelope, opening and closing of doors and windows, circulation and recirculation of air, and stack effect between buildings. Another factor is related to the selection of materials and furniture, where designers play an important role. Volatile organic compounds or formaldehyde is emitted by various building materials such as flooring and insulation, finishes such as paints, varnishes, and furniture. Semi-volatile compounds like phthalates in wall coverings, carpets, or textiles affect the health of individuals. They can cause harmful effects ranging from discomfort to severe health impairment when exposed to high concentrations. HVAC systems affect the temperature, relative humidity, carbon dioxide, and the concentration of particles and odor. It can also affect the infection risk through airborne microbes and pathogen concentration. The design and operation of such systems depend on the ventilation rates and outdoor air intake, positive and negative pressure relationship, and the maintenance and operation of the system. Use of cleaning solutions and detergents releases a range of chemicals. In some cases, cleaning and disinfectant activities can increase the humidity and, as a consequence, facilitate the growth and survival of microorganisms. Some ineffective cleaning procedures have resulted in higher concentration of particulate matter, aerosols, and dust. Generally, cleaning procedures are effective in reducing but not eliminating such concentrations. Ultimately, hospital staff, patients, and visitors could increase the concentration of airborne pathogens. In addition, human activities could carry particle mass like PM2.5. Certain medical treatments and equipment use radon, phthalates, and other endocrine disrupting chemicals that could be dangerous for sensitive patients even when exposed for a shorter duration. Some treatments have also resulted in microbial and chemical peaks. So it is important to understand the interplay of these factors affecting indoor air quality and its health impact. The government, academia, and industry stakeholders are constantly working to establish an ecosystem of research on IAQ in India. However, public awareness of indoor air quality issues and the importance of taking action to improve indoor air quality is still growing. It is a collective responsibility to ensure that every breath taken indoors contributes to a healthier, happier, and safer life for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipanjali. Our next speaker is Dr. Brendon Burley. Brendon is a healthcare practice leader at BKM and Associates. And as I also mentioned, he's a chair of ASHRAE Standard 62.1. And Brendon will be taking us through why is ventilation for healthcare different. So over to you, Brendon.
Thank you very much.
You may present your slides, yeah?
Yes. So hopefully everyone sees my slides now.
Brendon, I'm looking at the presenter view.
I need to change the screen. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So appreciate the introduction and the context for why we're here today. I want to present to all of you a little bit about what ASHRAE does and its history with ventilation. We're going to start off by talking about just ventilation practices in general, what ASHRAE's ventilation standards are, some of the common requirements between our general ventilation standards, residential ventilation standards, and healthcare ventilation standards, and then some unique requirements for our healthcare ventilation standards. And we're going to summarize at the very end just to draw up a conclusion. So being as I am more of a generalist, I'm going to start with the general ventilation and the history here. Around the 18th century, Common Era, the belief was that carbon dioxide was the cause of bad indoor air quality. And this was slowly overturned in the 19th century to include other biological contaminants. And carbon dioxide was seen not as a problem in and of itself, but more of an indicator of poor indoor air quality. If you have higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, it means that there are more people present and therefore more biological contaminants. More recently, we've gone beyond just biological contaminants to look at a broader range of organic excellence. We're also now starting to be very aware of particulates, not only in the context of microbiologicals and viruses, such as the very recent SARS-CoV-2 virus, but also in the context of PM 2.5 and PM1 ultrafine particles as being topics of consideration for our current standards. So it might be that the 21st century goes beyond even this. Healthcare actually has a much longer history with ventilation than the general understanding and focused less on contaminants and more on getting fresh air to patients and keeping the environment clean. So as far back as the 1st century in ancient Greece, there were requirements that you have an open window in each patient, in each patient room. This model evolved in the middle centuries, so 15th century to around 19th century, to take the idea of open windows on the exterior and what's called a central fireplace. Whether this was large braziers or if it was individual fireplaces in the center of the room and lofted ceilings. There are several examples of this throughout history. But the idea here is that you would have those open windows. You could draw air in from the side of the building, lift it up in the center of the building, carried by the thermal plume from the fire, and taken to the outside. In the United States, as mechanical ventilation became more prevalent, we eventually passed the Hill-Burton Act in the 1950s, which led to the first standards for mechanical ventilation of healthcare spaces. And these were actually interesting because this is where we get a lot of the 2 air changes and 6 air changes traditionally. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So let's take a brief look at ASHRAE standards. Originally, ASHRAE just had standard 62. That was ventilation. Over time, this has divided in 3 ways. And we now have 62.1, which is ventilation and acceptable indoor air quality, 62.2, which is ventilation for residential, and standard 170, which is ventilation for healthcare. And it is very interesting that standard 170 is not in the 62 family anymore. There's a reason for that, but it's not really apropos for this conversation. But very interesting story there as to why that gets separated out. So let's talk about some things that these standards are trying to achieve. So the general side, as well as the residential side, is looking at acceptable indoor air. The definition of acceptable in our general ventilation standard is that we have no known hazards in the air, and that 80% of the occupants do not deem the air objectionable. A large part of whether or not the air is objectionable has been tied to odors. So if you look at a lot of the older studies on ventilation, we're looking at whether or not people felt that there was a bad odor in the room. Oftentimes it was related to human body odors, which ties back into the history of biological contamination. On the healthcare side, the emphasis is to control odor and provide asepsis. And asepsis is very interesting. If there are any medical professionals, I'm sure that they will complain that we are using asepsis incorrectly because it refers to the absence of microbiologicals within a surgical field. The idea here is that the air should be a surgical field in a healthcare facility. In reality, we know that this is not the case. You are not going to achieve no microbiologicals inside your air. But a lot of the goals of the healthcare ventilation standard is to limit the amount of microbiologicals you have, particularly infectious aerosols. So these standards define the amount of outdoor air required in different ways. Both 62.1 and 62.2 look at an approach that takes into account ventilation required for people and ventilation required for area. So the ventilation required for people is expressed in terms of bedrooms in the residence. But this is an amount of outside air that is there to manage people and their activities. And it varies based on the metabolic rate of the person, the type of work that they're doing. The area rate is supposed to look at off-gassing from furnishings and furniture within the spaces, as well as wall finishes. If anyone has ever painted a room, they know that it can produce a lot of volatile organic compounds, VOCs. It smells. Those can be harmful, and we do have greener products and greener technologies that reduce that load on the space, but anything that you put into a space could potentially give off contaminants over its lifetime, and therefore we ventilate to prevent that. In 62.1, we also have system effects. And what this is looking at the air distribution system and giving credit for efficient removal of contaminants from the space or delivering outside air directly to occupants within the breathing zone. So systems like displacement ventilation, where you get fresh air in close to a person early on, and you have contaminated air move out away from the person just through natural air currents, it gives a greater credit. You don't have to condition as much outside air, which is very important from energy savings, versus a mixing system or a system where you just try to transfer air through a door from another room. You aren't actually getting fresh air to the people in the space very effectively, so you take a hit, a deficit on your ventilation. In healthcare, I've heard different stories as to the history of this, but a lot of this goes back to tuberculosis wards. And at some point, a calculation was done to figure out what is the amount of air that exchanges through an open window within a typical patient room. And the number that was arrived at was 2 air changes. And so we've been stuck with 2 air changes as the minimum for outdoor airflow in healthcare for a very, very, very long time. There are some spaces, such as procedure rooms, operating rooms, certain types of isolation environments where we want more outdoor air, but there is no space in clinical practice that goes below 2 air changes, and it just has to do with the history of the standard. So what is the basis for these requirements? Well, there have been studies done. So on the general side, we do have several studies looking at the amount of CFM required per person. And this is varied widely and has trended down since it was originally proposed. 8 liters per second per person is a pretty good number, which if you do the conversion is a little bit less than 5 CFM per person, which just happens to be what the general ventilation standard uses for most spaces. If you, again, have little children, people doing exercise, or people doing hard labor, then we'll use 7.5 or even 10 CFM per person because that's the response from a bioeffluence perspective. In terms of the CFM per square foot, a range of studies have been done by different groups, and it depends a lot on the materials, but you can see that we have a typical set of values. Now, the thing is that we haven't tested every space that we specify for. So a lot of our requirements are just rational requirements. So for a very good example of a rational requirement is making sure that you have an adequate drain pan following a cooling coil and making sure that it is draining effectively. We know that you can get biofouling on a cooling coil. We also know that if you blow that air through a building, you could spread that mold, that fungus, those other microbiologicals throughout your whole building. So we have not necessarily studied how far that goes down a system. We just know that it's not a good idea to create a condition where you introduce a hazard. So that's a rational reason not to do things. Recently, ASHRAE did a thorough study of all of the requirements within Standard 170 to understand what portion of their requirements were founded in evidence, what portion were rational, which were clinical practices and traditions, and which were unsupported. And as you can see, a lot of the requirements for ventilation healthcare systems are unsupported by any evidence or a rational reasoning. Doesn't mean that they're invalid. It just shows that there's a lot of tradition here. When you're talking about 2,000 years of ventilation practice, there are a lot of things where people have forgotten why we do them, or it was never written down. But it works, and so we haven't changed it. So let's talk about a few things that are common between these two standards. All of them talk about separation distances, which Deepanjali mentioned as well. We want to make sure that you're not near to a source of contamination. Both of these standards talk about filtration, and there's filtration for 2 purposes. One is to protect the equipment and the quality of the air coming into the building. The other is to provide clean air to a space. The latter is more often used in healthcare, whereas the former is used in all standards. And the last common requirement is maintenance. You can design a system that's very good at providing ventilation, but if you don't maintain that system, then you're going to be left with a situation where, well, you don't actually have good ventilation. So a little bit more about separation distances. Some of the key things that the ventilation standards look at, and both standards have the same table, although in healthcare, they want larger distances than for a general building, are exhaust discharges from the building. So this can be relief air from the building. It can be exhaust air from certain spaces. It can be plumbing vents, which is another topic there. It could be generator stacks. It could be furnace stacks. Anything that's going to introduce air pollution needs to be kept away from where you bring fresh air or outdoor air into the building. Another thing that needs to be looked at is vehicle pathways. So anytime you have a parking garage or a major highway nearby to your building, you don't want to be bringing in the odors off the road and the exhaust byproducts, the combustion byproducts from vehicle exhaust into your building. So there are rules about separating your outdoor air intakes from those locations. And then we have our lovely picture of the trash dump, which is just site contamination. If you know that you have bad conditions nearby in your site, you may want to take additional measures to basically protect yourself against bringing in any contaminated air to the building. What about contaminated air that's already in the building? Well, the standards address this too, and we address this through recirculation. There are some basic rules that should be applied pretty much anywhere. One, air must always move from cleaner spaces to dirtier spaces. So if you have room that stores something that's going to produce odors or contaminants, the last thing you want to do is allow that air to move over to a room that's generally clean or uncontaminated. If you have a room that's dealing with substances that create a hazard for people, then you don't want it to move anywhere in the building. You want to move it outside of the building. So the way ASHRAE's looked at this is we've basically created 4 categories of air. Class 1 air is clean air. It's not going to be objectionable to anyone. Class 2 air has low intensity contaminants. This is the type of stuff that you might smell in a bakery or a restaurant, just the odors of food, things that you might find objectionable, you might notice, but generally most people will just say, oh, there's an odor here. Class 3 is where there's a high intensity of contaminants, where everyone will notice, and even if it's a pleasant smell, you might not like it. I don't know how much incense or potpourri are used in India, but you can always tell here in the States, if you go into someone's home where they like to burn things or have a lot of masking odors in a space, some people don't find that very pleasant. That would be a type of class 3 air. And then class 4 air is typically things where you're dealing with laboratories or spaces where you know that there's something in the air that could be harmful to a person who isn't prepared. Any place where a person would normally wear PPE to work in, that air should never make its way back into the building. It needs to go outside. And you can see how this translates in healthcare. Healthcare has looked at this and said that, okay, anywhere we specify negative pressure for a room, it should be considered that there's class 2 air. If we require exhaust from a room, it should be class 3 air. And then spaces that are listed, basically, we know that these spaces have people with infectious diseases that could be transmitted via aerosol. Those spaces need to be class 4 air. So even though the terminology is different, they follow the same principle here in terms of recirculation. And in fact, recently, Standard 170 did adopt an informative appendix to create this direct relationship between the air classifications and their own spaces. Lastly, let's talk about maintenance. A big thing with maintenance is system balancing. When you have these large HVAC systems, you're delivering air from the outdoor, conditioning it, and then spreading it out to a number of different spaces within the facility. If you don't balance the air correctly, you could have one room that gets a lot of nice, clean air and a bunch of other rooms that are starved. This helps you not only with your ventilation, but it helps you with your temperature control and your humidity control. Another common thing with maintenance is you need to ensure that you're keeping moisture out of your air planes. So if you do have humidification systems, it's important to make sure that you have safety devices to prevent the accumulation of moisture, that you use the right materials, that you have pathways and clear drains so that moisture can leave the system. You also need to be checking your filters to make sure that they aren't bypassing excessively, that they are capturing what they need to capture. They're not creating excessive pressure drop, which is more of an energy issue than a ventilation issue. And that they're providing the necessary protection of the airstream. The other thing that needs to be considered is the control inputs. Modern ventilation systems require a lot of monitoring of airflow rates, of temperatures, of humidities to make sure that we're maintaining the right environment. And we'll talk more about temperature and humidity because it's very important to healthcare practice. But the idea here is that you don't want your sensors to get out of drift. And most building sensors are good for anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And so ASHRAE's ventilation standards say that if you do have an instrumented building, you need to be going in there and calibrating those sensors on a regular basis to ensure that the system continues to operate in the manner that it was designed. So moving on to healthcare specific requirements. One of the things that healthcare does that the general standards don't is they specify a total amount of air that needs to circulate through the space. And this is related to the average residence time of air, which is related to the contaminant removal effectiveness. And airflow patterns do play a role in this. And we'll talk a little bit about specific examples in healthcare where we specify the type of airflow pattern you need. But in general, what healthcare does is it says not only do you need outdoor air, but you need a certain total amount of air to move through the space to make sure that that air is well mixed, recirculated, and fresh. Many studies have been done, since this is theoretical and based on mixing of air, that show that you get diminishing returns. It's a standard exponential curve, falls off somewhere between 6 and 8 air changes per hour is where you start seeing reduced benefits in terms of your ability to efficiently remove contaminants from the space. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard the term 6 air changes per hour in the last 3 years. This is where that came from. It's directly related to our history with getting the air moving and cleared out of a space on a regular interval. Another thing that healthcare does is it looks at in-room recirculation. So if any of you have installed filters in your office or your residence in order to clean the air here, in healthcare, you're not necessarily allowed to do that in every space. And the reason for that is that those units can actually have negative impacts if applied incorrectly. So if you're trying to achieve a certain airflow pattern within a space, and you put in an in-room recirculation unit that fights that airflow pattern, you may prevent yourself from getting the most benefit out of that recirculation unit. Now, there are situations, particularly in older facilities, where you don't have a mechanical ventilation system capable of providing the total air changes in the space. In that case, what the healthcare ventilation standard says is if you put a HEPA filter, a high efficiency particulate filter into that system, then you can use that recirculating unit to get those total air changes up. And the idea is that that HEPA filter will take out any contaminants that pass through it, or at least enough of them that it's equivalent to bringing in that air from a system and moving it through the rest of the system in filters to get those contaminants out of the air. Gaseous contaminants are not impacted by standard HEPA filters. If you have a concern about a gas phase contaminant, then you need to look at carbon filters or active air cleaning technology. But you do want to be careful about that. There are testing standards being developed right now for safety. If you want a preview of them, they were actually put into the recently published standard 241 that talks about some of the safety requirements that ASHRAE would like to see for active air cleaning technology. So I mentioned earlier that filters are similar and different. The way that they're different in healthcare is that if you have a high efficiency filter, which the healthcare standard is considered MERV 14 and higher. MERV is ASHRAE's filter rating standard. Many of you might be familiar with ISO standards. So there's not a clear relationship between MERV and ISO, but typically if you have an ISO key 2.5 filter, you're probably close to a MERV 11, 12. If you get to a 2.5, 70%, then you're close to a 14. People have put charts together. Just be mindful that it's not a perfect conversion. If you have those high efficiency filters, they want to protect the actual airstream that gets delivered to the care area. So those filters need to be after every component in your system. So downstream of your supply fans, your coils, everything. You want to make sure that the last thing that air sees before it enters into the space is the filter. If you have a lower efficiency filter, then the idea is that this is mostly there to protect the equipment and to minimize the amount of other things that recirculate through the air, microbiological. So you can put those anywhere you want in the system. They don't have to be up front. They could be at the back with the MERV 14, but the general ventilation standard is going to want you to have a minimum filter in front of all of your wetted coils so that you don't get that biological growth that we talked about. So another thing that healthcare does that's not required, well, I shouldn't say not required in the general standard, but not is emphasized, is pressurization. We mentioned that the idea is that you want air to move from cleaner spaces to dirtier spaces. In healthcare, spaces that are designated as clean, they have to be positively pressurized. So what that means is that they need to promote outward airflow. So you're pushing that clean air out of that space into the rest of the building. What that does is it prevents dirty air from moving back into the space. And you can see the types of spaces where we like to see positive pressure. Spaces that are known to be dirty, have dirty air, we want those negatively pressurized. So we want them to actually draw in air from the surrounding spaces. And the reason for that is that we want to keep the bad stuff inside so that it can be moved to the outside of the building. Now, you do get into situations quite frequently where you may have two positive spaces next to each other or two negative spaces next to each other. And a decision has to be made about which direction you need to go. So a common example that comes up in the United States is if you have a central processing or a central sterile supply for your operating rooms, the requirements right now are that the operating room be the most clean space. The problem is when a procedure is happening, you are actually creating contamination within that operating room. And that can move out to your sterile core, which can lead to a spread of infections. And there are institutions that have basically told their HJ, we have years of data showing that if you positively pressurize that sterile core area and let that clean supply move into the operating room, that you get fewer infections. And they're allowed to continue to operate in that manner. So this is always a very good discussion to have with your clinicians. I realize I'm a little short on time. I have a few more slides to go, so I might pick up the pace here a little bit. Diffuser types. This is something that healthcare does as well. We want certain diffusers to be used in certain areas. There's a definite bias towards overhead mixing systems, the exception being operating rooms and burn units where we want to see more of a laminar flow, or in older designed operating rooms, you can get an air curtain effect where you put linear diffusers around the edge of your sterile field. The reason why we want this is because we want to create certain motions within the rooms. Displacement, as I mentioned earlier, is acceptable in patient rooms. You want to be careful about its application elsewhere in the facility, though. Specific to operating rooms, we want to make sure that there's coverage over the sterile field. So we specify that you have to cover 70% of the operating table with a low velocity air. We also want our returns low into the outside. And the reason for this is we want to create a plug flow over the table. Anything that's under that table will be clean and be kept clean by the air. Because we're using non-aspirating type diffusers, we don't get a lot of induction from the recirculation regions in the room. The clean air sweeps down over the operating field, moves to the edge of the room, and clears out. Another place where we look at specific placement of air devices is in airborne infection isolation rooms. In this case, we want the exhaust to be near the head of the patient bed because that's where the coughs are generated. And in rooms that didn't have this during COVID, Some institutions developed these ventilated headboards that they would tie into their exhaust systems, where they would just put a hood over top of the bed to achieve the same effect. The idea here is that you want to capture those coughs, that biological exhalant as close to the source as possible, so it doesn't actually mix in with the rest of the room. The other thing that happens is we put the supply diffuser near to the door, so it creates that somewhat buffer region right there at the door in terms of a local positive pressure, while the overall room is negative, drawing air in from the outside. A couple other areas that are unique. Pharmacies, we don't specify pharmacy ventilation. And the reason is because that countries' pharmacopoeia standards usually dictate what's required in these spaces. So in the United States, this is USP. India may follow a different standard. There's other very large standards are the Japanese pharmacopoeia standard and the European pharmacopoeia standard. I apologize, but I do not know what India's pharmacopoeia standard is. I'm sure one of the other panelists could fill me in. Sterile processing is another item that gets looked at closely in healthcare. And this is related to where we clean and process the medical instruments. We reference standards, Association of Advancement for Medical Instrumentation. And this is somewhat of a circular situation because they look to us to specify the ventilation. And then when they specify the ventilation, we look to them. So we're kind of chasing each other's tail in terms of what goes on in these environments. But the general idea still holds. Keep the clean spaces clean, keep air from moving out of dirty spaces. If you follow those principles, you'll generally be all right with the sterile processing. But again, this is a situation where you want to check with your local regulators. The last thing I want to mention before I conclude here is temperature and humidity. Temperature and humidity are specified for healthcare locations, and this is related to the Sterling chart. It's a very old chart that showed an optimum zone for biological control. A lot of work has been done recently questioning the validity of this chart, particularly as we learn more about microbiologicals and viruses in particular, and the behavior of different viruses in different environments. Depending on your climate, it may actually be beneficial to you to favor drier environments because most of your infectious agents favor moist environments, and the opposite could be true in other cases. So to summarize, the biggest differentiator between healthcare ventilation and regular ventilation is achieving asepsis, which means controlling the migration of microbiologicals throughout the space. The way this is achieved is through source control, pressurization, filtration, and air exchanges. The emphasis of airflow patterns, making sure that we provide air where it's needed and we take air out where we expect large quantities of contaminants. And then the last one is the prescription of environmental conditions to control microbiologicals instead of just comfort. And I apologize, I did go a little bit over, but that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Brendon. I'd request everybody to please pose their questions to Brendon over the Q&A. I think, Brendon, there are already 1 or 2 questions for you. Now we'll have Dr. Shukla Das, the head faculty department of microbiology at the UCMS. Her work is focused on immunology, and she'll be providing an insight into biological contaminants, mitigation strategies. Over to you, Dr. Shukla Das. You can share your screen.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you. And I'm glad to be here from SIE. And my previous speakers and Dr. Brendon have done most of the elements of today's talk is almost like covered. Just let me just share my slide. Can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Okay. No.
We can see your screen.
Is it now?
Yes, it's on the key messages at the moment.
Yeah, 1 minute. Okay, so that's it. Now can you see?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
All right. Yeah. Thank you again. So the air pollution, I'm going to take you through. Most of the slides have already been covered by the previous speakers. This is a very familiar slide which tells you that globally air pollution has proven to be a major health problem. It's causing one of the 4th main important causes of premature mortality. Global burden diseases in a study in 2022 has stated that air pollution is the second most highest risk for causing health issues and the 4th most important cause for causing premature birth and preterm mortality. And the still in India, the problem is still so high because the outdoor air quality is still so compromised because 2.6 billion are still using heating sources of burning wood, agriculture, crops, smoke, etc. And when we talk about the hospital, the indoor air quality is still in a hospital is a big challenge. These have already been covered by Panjali. They have said that the particulate matter and the gaseous material, and these are all either they are suspended or they are deposited on the ground, which pose major health issues to the population. Indoor air pollution sources in a house is very similar, but this slide tells you it is from PGI Chandigarh. So they have very beautifully captured that what is the surrounding areas in a hospital. So as been rightly said that whatever is your surrounding, those outdoor pollutants will be a source for the indoor air quality. And the indoor air quality of a hospital is always a very big challenge because it's a complex system. The hospital, as you can see, it's always a working cycle. There are the traffic is always going on. There are patients, healthcare workers, the relatives, they are constantly moving. And of course, as has been said, there are a lot of elements that are being used like the elements like gaseous particles, the sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, and all these gaseous material are not only eliminating from the various instruments that are being used, like nebulizers, and also from the tubings, the plastic tubings, the blood bags, the catheters, they also release a lot of elements in the environment. So these are the gaseous per se can be causing a lot of health aspects to the patients, but they are majorly a carrier and a vehicle for the bioparticles, the microorganisms. And we need to understand that the humans are exposed to a vast array of microbes, and it is ubiquitously present. So when the microbial contamination exceeds a certain limit, that can pose a danger. That is where we need to follow or draw some standards. So the sources of bioaerosols, as we know that there can be primary bioaerosols or secondary. The secondary are the end products. So these can be the volatile organic compounds or the endotoxin, the mycotoxin, or their damaged nucleic acid proteins and cell membrane. Whereas the living ones are the ones which are viable and they can be carried long distances. So the areas have already been defined. These are in the hospital, there are a large number of areas where these bioaerosols and the chemical gaseous elements can stay and may cause a lot of health issues. Indoor air supply in the hospital, there are complex instruments that are being used like nebulizers, bronchoscopies, then humidifiers and HVAC system. These are very saddened to say that, disheartening to know this, that most of our tertiary care hospitals do not have any standards that are being followed. Until and unless a repair is required, the systems are not cleaned up, or there is no regular system for checking these systems, whether the air current is flowing or whether the AC system is working or not, or the heating system is working. So they are actually harboring and are reservoirs of lot of microbes, not only bacteria but viruses and fungi. So the sizes of the bacteria can range from 1 to 10 micrometer. Viruses are even smaller. The healthcare hospital sources, other than these, we were wondering whether even the tubings, the plastic tubings, the nasal cannulas, These can also be a source of phthalates and glutaraldehyde, formaldehyde. These are emitted from the disinfectants and the sterilants that are being used in the hospital for cleaning the areas and cleaning the rooms and floor, etc. So of the biological bioaerosols, the most dangerous particulate matter that we look for are the ones which can travel long distances. So the distance, the substances, the particulate matter can range from 1 micron, 0.2 micron or 0.1 micron to 10 micrometers. So the ones which are lighter remain suspended, and of those material, of those bioaerosols, Legionella, E. coli, Pseudomonas, these are a few bacterial infections that may harbor and they may stay in the hospital environment and cause infections. And these are the bugs which are now causing multi-drug resistance bugs, and these drug-resistant bacteria can cause hospital-associated outbreaks and which is now one of the major problems in globally as well as in India. WHO has said that a microbial load in our workplace should be less than 1,000 colony forming unit, and the PM 2.5, if it is more than 10 G per cubic meter of volume of air, it is considered to be a high risk. Well, the air quality index is, that is what the Central Pollution Board, they usually monitor. It is calculated for 5 air pollutants for a Clean Air Act. So this, I'm not talking to going into the details. So they have divided into the index, whether 0 to 50 or 51 to 100, depending upon the these pollutants that are calculated, the particulate, ozone level, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. Accordingly, these are being monitored in the outdoor air. Nothing of this sort is followed in for the indoor air quality, and we do get from CPCB such reports where it is telling us the nocturnal, diurnal, seasonal variation of the pollutants. So these bioaerosols will have aerodynamic properties and a trajectory motion which will decide whether they fall, where is their density maximum, whether it is on the ground or they are maximum in the suspended areas. The sizes have been already, I think you are all familiar with. So in a human body, more than 10 micrometer size do not enter into the alveoli in the lungs. So they remain within the nasal cavity. 5 to 10 micrometer can go into the upper respiratory tract. Less than 5 micrometer can reach the alveoli and lower respiratory tract. And a 5-minute coughing can generate, can you see the large number of droplet nuclei? And each of them can carry, if you consider a hospital or a ward with about 20 to 40 patients in one ward. So imagine an infection where there are patients harboring patients of diphtheria, pertussis. These are almost like very fatal infections. These can be aerosolized and the environment, and they may cause outbreak in the hospital. Droplet nuclei usually is less than 5 micrometer, may remain suspended, and the most deadly infections out of which have been carried by these less than 5 micrometers, tuberculosis, measles, and chickenpox, and of course not to forget about the SARS-CoV-2, which had caused havoc in most of the tertiary care hospitals because we were overcrowded with patients. And imagine these patients were 20 to 40 in one unit, and they were being canalized, they were receiving oxygen, high flow cannula oxygen, and there was so much of aerosolization. So imagine instead of containment, there was spread of this COVID virus within the hospital environment. Factors which are maintaining the viability of these bioaerosol have been already told, because depends upon the relative humidity and the temperature. Transmission is how the air moves within the hospital. Survival is at various temperatures, and the viruses are unique because once they get encapsulated in a droplet nuclei within a hygroscopic molecule, they may stay viable for a very long time. There are various microorganisms. This list is, you may just get overwhelmed by looking at these. These are the most deadliest and one of the containment level 4 pathogens that if such kind of bioaerosols are released or are present in the hospital environment, then definitely you will be anticipating an outbreak in with these infections. Now, bioaerosols in an animal environment is also very important. They are a big source. So if you have a cattle or a shed, and animal husbandry around a hospital environment, then these can also produce a lot of outdoor contamination, which may have entry into the indoor air, maybe a cause of indoor air pollution. This is just a list telling you the fungi, viruses, and bacteria. Fungi is one of the, again, one of WHO has now listed our priority list, that now maybe after a major pandemic of viruses, beware, the population has to be now looking for a viral attack by a fungal attack in near future, because the fungus is something which we ignore, and they reside in most of these humid atmosphere in these AC ducts. And usually the ACs are not cleaned during winters. And when you do an air spore count after the winters, you will find that they are million. The count is so high from these AC ducts. These are the list of pathogens. I think I will not go into this. This is the priority list which I'm trying to show, where WHO has categorized these fungi, and they are all having aerial transmission. And this slide tells you that imagine in 5 micrometer size of an aerosol, the viral copies can range from just number 10 to hundreds and thousands of viral copies in one aerosol molecule of 5 micrometer size. So right from influenza, if there is an outbreak or there is an index case, immediate isolation. And what we have just heard from the previous speaker, we really require good ventilation and pressure units in hospitals, where such immediate isolations of deadly fungi or viral infections, if we encounter, they can be isolated immediately. And not to forget that these agents can become bioterrorism agents as well. So the effects are health as well as social and economic impact. The bioaerosols not only has been listed by Dipanjali, not only causes infectious as well as non-infectious. Non-infectious are, they may cause allergic bronchitis. They may not directly be responsible for causing any infection within the human body, but their byproducts or the toxins that has been released may cause allergic manifestation. So this is how the lung infection is caused. And imagine a person who is coughing releases so many droplet nuclei. The rest of the agents these are taken from documented literature, where it tells you right from CNS to CVS to GIT system, and any of the anatomical sites, even premature birth and pregnancy related complications are associated with air pollution. Social impact and economic impact has already been touched upon. I will just take you through this, a very interesting paper where they have listed out factors which are related to hospital internal air quality, where it has already been enumerated that the ventilation system, the construction, the infrastructure that is available, the occupant activities, and the traffic in the hospital will decide upon the standards of the internal air quality of hospital. So I am coming from 1900 bedded East Delhi hospital, tertiary care hospital, where there is a lot of migrant population coming from the neighboring states, and it is always the beds are full. We have just 8 ICUs, and each contains about 8 beds. So there's always a dearth of beds, and there is overcrowding. The hospital associated pollutants are these. Not only they are chemical agents, but all these bacterial, fungal, and viruses, they are a huge risk to the health. Now, this is again taken from a very interesting paper where they have enumerated, like ASHRAE and the other units have identified a preferable, acceptable levels of glutaraldehyde and some of the chemical agents, and some air exchanges which are permissible in intensive care unit and OTs, but none of this is kind of followed in our hospitals. The sampling techniques have to be again standardized, which will tell you, because what data that we collect will be the basis of our standards. If we lay down today in India, we must have our own standards, and for that we require most of the hospitals to collect data so that the cutoff values for which the bioaerosol cutoff value or the PM 2.5 or 10 will tell us that beyond this is a dangerous danger to the hospital environment.
Dr. Shukla, if I may ask you to please
Yeah.
summarize. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on my last few slides. So
Thank
so this is how we take either a passive sampling or we do active sampling. And we are doing a passive sampling in our hospitals. And control strategies has already been identified, but we are not following these. We require a ventilation system, a unidirectional flow, and a configuration which will be suitable to mitigate all these problems which we face. Okay, I'll just tell you, take you through my, this is one of the NABH standards which are followed in India, and we have modular OTs where they have laid down standards for OTs where air exchanges per hour should be a minimum of 20, or, these are NABH standards, and these boards are being followed by a lot of hospitals. So this is what we need to follow, or there are better standards which is applicable to tertiary care hospitals. And this is what our study when we did an indoor air sampling. So these are the outdoor colonies that we have around our hospitals. The settle plate contained so much of bacterial contents and fungus. We did a small study on the allergic fungal sinusitis, and we found that there was a dysregulated immune dysregulation in these patients. We did flow cytometer, and the kind of even the histopathology showed that there has been allergic changes in these patients. So definitely it is a big problem. And not only ABPA, lung cancers, these are a big problem. And the fungal surveillance, the microbial surveillance in a tertiary care hospital, including the ICUs and OTs, it is a must and should become mandatory to at least know the baseline. Maybe you can have the ventilations and the HEPA filters, the filters may be the laminar flow in the OTs, but how do we know that our standards are being maintained? So we need to monitor and have these air culture monitoring standards in each hospital. This is a picture of the mucormycosis, which was an outbreak during our COVID period, and we had 800 cases, and the hospital was flooded with mucor patients, and there was a high mortality. So last slide, my key message is that implementation of IAQ standards and guidelines in India is definitely required. There should be mandatory regulatory body for surveillance of IAQ in hospitals to monitor health-associated risk factors and mitigation strategies. We have OTs which are working round the clock, and we have 4 hours to 8 hours surgeries which are happening, and we are maintaining these standards only by doing a settle plate method, which probably is not good enough to to lay down standards for in a big hospital like us. So thank you. I'm sorry for taking more time.
I know, Dr. Shukla, you have a lot to say. So, but
Thank you
thank
so
you
much.
very much for your presentation and and also bringing the biology in the indoor air quality and, relating it with respect to, understanding the first, what Brendon spoke about, how ventilation is important, and especially realizing these are class 4 contaminants, biological contaminants. So it's very interesting to see, you bringing that in. Any questions for Dr. Shukla Das can be put in the Q&A. And now we have Ravideep Singh, Associate Director at the Creative Designer Architect, sharing some examples of implementing indoor environment quality solutions in hospitals. Ravideep, over to you.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. Yeah. Is the screen visible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for having me. So as a part of my agenda on healthcare design today, I guess a significant part of the technicalities pertaining to healthcare environments and different departments have been very comprehensively covered. So I will start more on a fundamental level as an architect, what our end goals are when we talk about designing a hospital. So we look at it in 2 ways. One is emulating empathy, and the second is stimulating care. And both of these happens by creating a more conducive environment for our end users. And our key end users are the caregivers who render care and the patients who are already under a very high degree of stress due to anxiety of treatment, invasion of privacy, cause of medical bills, and so on. So how we can sort of create a more conducive environment for both of these is something we're going to look at. These are some visual of the caregivers. So there have been numerous studies because of the increasing stress. There have been a significant shortage of registered nurses, practitioners, and so on. And a larger part of this is pertaining to the healthcare environment and the environment inside the hospital building. So when we look at reduction of stress amongst all the end users, there are three key areas we look at. And indoor air quality is one of the most significant area that plays a vital role in alleviating the stress. The second is, of course, nature and biophilia, which also plays a very significant role in terms of creating a more conducive environment for the end users. And the third is, of course, lighting. So all these three areas put together create a more healthy environment that sort of stimulates wellness. Talking particularly about indoor environment design, we have four areas from a design standpoint. We look at the ventilation standards, we look at the filtration standards, we look at abatement of volatile organic compounds and harmful contaminants, and humidity. So when we talk about a hospital, I mean, in terms of the equity of care, I would fundamentally break it down into four levels. One is the outpatient, ambulatory, or therapeutic areas. The second is inpatient. Third would be critical care, and fourth would be surgery. Now, the equity of care and the degree of, I would say, filtration, ventilation, the humidity, and the monitoring would significantly increase in all these four areas, with the ambulatory being the minimum and the surgery requiring the highest standards of all of these. In terms of abatement of indoor contaminants, we look at abatement of volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, microbial pathogens, particularly carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. In terms of air filtration, we look at particularly two types of filtration. One is the carbon filtration, which is to remove larger particles. And then we look at media filters, which is particularly for smaller particles. And then in terms of ducts, which happened significantly after COVID, we look at ultraviolet, UVGI, and photocatalytic oxidation. In terms of ventilation, we have the ASHRAE 55 and 170. And the air changes would vary, I would say, from in an outpatient area to 2 air exchanges to, I would say, 20 air exchanges inside an operation theater. Humidity, again, plays, I think this was discussed previously, plays a very important role, particularly in healthcare environments. There have been significant studies that talk about burn patients. If the humidity is increased from, say, 60 to 80%, it adds significantly to the recovery rates. So all these areas put together create a more conducive environment for the patients. Now, this is a typical inpatient floor layout, which generally contributes to about 50–60% of the hospital area. Now, I would break it down into three areas. One is the core patient area where the patient resides. The second is the nursing station, staff support, and all these store areas. And the third would be the extremely clean or dirty areas like the toilets, the soiled areas. Now, I think Brendon had spoken about the ASHRAE standards of the number of air exchanges and the MERV rating and so on. So I've just put it down in terms of patient rooms would require 6 air changes, relative humidity of about 60%. When it comes to nurse stations or supporting areas, we look at about 2 air changes, the relative humidity of about 60%. But when you talk about toilets or more soiled areas, we look at an air exchanges of at least 10. So this is a more detailed layout of a single room where these metrics are followed. And this is just a visual just to understand, apart from the technicalities, a larger view window makes a lot of difference in terms of the indoor air quality. So there is a school of thought wherein toilets are placed on the outside, which is called the outboard patient room, compromising the amount of natural light and the daylight that penetrates inside. Now, there have been a lot of evidence-based studies that talk about daylight penetration, which is a sort of a UV penetration inside, and that enhances the quality of indoor air significantly, apart from helping the patient from a circadian perspective. Now, from an architecture perspective, I would walk you through 2 case studies So one case study is of a hospital wherein the real estate allowed us to have a courtyard and green spaces. And the second one would be where there is no possibility in how we can create more green spaces for the patients. So we carved out a large central courtyard on the inside, as well as carved out green areas on the facade, which could function as respite areas for the patient and the relatives. Second, in terms of maximizing the daylight, we created canted windows so that the daylight penetration inside the room is significantly enhanced. This is what the outer facade looks like. So these are the green areas. And then we created a central atrium. So this is a functional diagram of the hospital wherein you have the central courtyard and there's a circular ambulatory corridor all along the courtyard connecting different departments. Now, from a patient standpoint, when I am circulating around this courtyard, I see the greenery each time I'm commuting between departments, which makes a lot of positive psychological impact on the patient experience. So this is a visual of the courtyard. Now, in terms of ventilating the courtyard and talking about the indoor air quality, we covered the courtyard at the third floor level, creating a sort of a triple height space. And through displacement ventilation, we ventilated the lower floors where the maximum human activity would happen so that the hot air rises. And this would help in terms of both air filtration, airflow, and thermal comfort. This is a typical layout of the corridor around green open areas with lots of natural light flowing in. Similarly for the inpatient floors. Now, this is a second case study wherein there's a tight-fitting urban hospital with absolutely no space to create a courtyard or a green space. What we did here was we carved out green spaces on the upper floors, which would serve as respite areas for the patient and the staff. So these are some visual of the green areas on the upper floors with a lot of vegetation. What it actually helps it enhances the amount of daylight that penetrates inside, which ultimately creates a better indoor environment and adds positively to the indoor air quality. These are some more examples of hospitals wherein we give sort of integrated green areas and courtyards in different forms and configurations. This is another built example of the kind of space where we were able to create a central atrium and have a lot of activity areas like cafes and staff waiting inside the central court. These are some ongoing projects wherein we have significantly experimented in terms of creating elevated green terraces. This is what the visual looks like. Then another very crucial aspect, I guess, which is now increasingly more relevant is what are the takeaways after the pandemic in terms of the HVAC system design. So hospitals obviously were very incapacitated during the pandemic, and what different measures we should take as an architect to make it more resilient for future pandemics. So we look at resilience in hospital design at 3 levels. One is the building, the second is the department, and third is the module level. So from a building level, we feel even if the real estate doesn't allow to create a large ward or an alternate care facility for isolated patients, some requisite thought in terms of the planning wherein the spaces are mechanically designed to be isolated in case it is required helps significantly. So this is the layout of the hospital I just talked about, the Max Hospital in Padparganj. What we have done is we've created a external corridor that links to the waiting areas. Now, in a normal scenario, this is the hospital waiting area. But when a pandemic or an infectious outbreak strikes, this corridor would lead to this waiting area, which would be isolated mechanically. Now, for this to happen, the mechanical system needs to be pre-designed in a way that it can be isolated as well as negatively pressurized to augment for patients who have communicable disease or an infectious outbreak. Now, taking it to a hospital level, one elevator was made to open on both sides and would straight away take it to an inpatient floor, which would again be mechanically isolated, which has provisions to be negatively pressurized and would have requisite levels of air filtration and ventilation and so on. So this thought beforehand in terms of the mechanical system planning would help any hospital moving ahead to be much more resilient in terms of responding to outbreaks. I mean, it's unpredictable when the COVID-19 stuck and hospitals all over the globe were not able to respond in the way they should, because although there were norms for asepsis and so on, but they were never complied with or enforced. So these thoughts, I mean, lessons learned would really help moving ahead in terms of creating a better environment and more resilient environment. This is a module level layout of a typical inpatient room. Now, in terms of design, we should have the vestibule spaces with provisions so that a portable anterooms could be created. That's one. And secondly, in case a higher level filtration is required, in case there's an infectious outbreak similar to the isolation floor that we just talked about, there should be provisions for a portable HEPA filter right over the patient bed, which would offer a very high degree of air filtration, depending on what kind of patient is being kept in. So in a normal mode, say 6 air changes happen, but in a pandemic mode, you could straight away turn it up to 12 air changes. Now, talking about execution strategies. So I think air monitoring and all of that is very crucial moving ahead. So nowadays, all the hospital projects we intend to do in Revit or building information modeling, which is a 3-dimensional platform wherein all the building information, right from architecture to the mechanical system, are modeled on a digital platform. Now, every stage of the project, right from concept to schematic to detailed design, incrementally information is being added and simulations are being done parallelly. Now, when the model is completely populated, this is handed over to a range of, say, LOD 500, which is the level of development, to the building management or the building operator, so that they are able to link this model to the building management systems. Now, once that is done, what you're able to do is to have a very high degree of visibility of all the systems, their state, how they are performing, how the occupancy is like. The AI in the building management system can help create preventive measures for potential breakdowns. I mean, you could regulate energy to better save on the electrical load and so on. So all this visibility helps significantly in terms of creating a more optimized and responsive environment in healthcare facilities, which are extremely energy intensive by all means. That's about it.
Thank you, Ravideep. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to thank all the speakers today for sharing their insights. Any questions, please post them. Considering the paucity of time, I'm going to defer the Q&A for now, but any questions that come up, we will share them with you and you can respond back to us. Our team will be collecting them and getting back to you. Next up, we have on October 11th, we have our next dialogue where we will be discussing the need of an IAQ metric, standards that are available today, and the measurements for IAQ. The link will be provided in the chat box for you to register. And a very big thank you to all participants as well for joining us today. Thank you.